We've heard a lot about climate change, not only from me, but Bob mentioned the double-headed crisis and the need for a just transition that has not only transition to zero carbon, but spatial rebalancing at its heart as well. And it's a particular problem for the UK, given the nature of our regional inequality. But obviously, this is a global problem, and one which is at the forefront of the agenda in a way that I don't think we've seen for decades. Next year, the UK will host COP26, which will establish us as a leader in, or put us on the map at least, on environmental sustainability. But as we know, there's much more to be done. And so we're going to hear from our three speakers about what that should be if we're going to create clean, inclusive growth. So I shall first hand over to Stephanie.
Sure. I might stand up just to make sure that everyone, or at least I, stay awake and vital. I've sort of learnt over the years, and particularly from working with Charlotte Aldrett, who was the backbone of our Inclusive Growth Commission a few years ago that I chaired, that I should try and not talk to audiences about things they know more about than I do. So I am going to leave a lot of the discussion of the incorporation of climate to my fellow panellists, who I've heard speak before and I know are going to be fantastic. But if Charlotte will excuse me, I'm going to insert a bit of macro reality and a bit of the world into this conversation, because I think it's important. You know, we can all get very comfortable in our focus on place and inclusive growth, and that being the most important thing. And it absolutely is, and I learnt that very much in doing the commission. But if we don't marry that agenda to the big picture of what's going on in the global economy, we're going to have trouble. So I'm going to insert a little bit of that big picture and then think about what does that leave? What are the takeaways for policymakers, and particularly for sort of macro policies, which we can then take with us when we think about how to incorporate place, people, and climate into those, what I think has to be a new macro and micro toolkit. So if you indulge me, I would say, we should remember for a start that although a recession globally or in the UK is probably not imminent. Back in my day job at this Bloomberg, there's probably the furious trading environment of a lot of the people using our products. They're feeling a bit more relaxed going into Christmas, but we know that it's certainly going to come sooner rather than later. And if there's a recession in the US, that most likely means a recession in the UK. And that, as we know, then throws up a lot of other policy challenges which might get in the way of all of our nice inclusive goals unless we work hard. The recovery now in the US is the longest. It's now about to go into its 12th year. That is the longest since 1854, and possibly by some records the longest ever. So, many people would say, that sounds like Donald Trump, but many people have said that we're on borrowed time in some sense. When it comes to the kind of things you do to increase the longevity of your recovery, we're not the only ones to have actually shot ourselves in the foot the last couple of years. So we've had Brexit and question marks about Brexit putting a halt on investment and slowing our growth just at a time when we might have actually got the sort of full advantages of having got past the global financial crisis. At the same time, the trade war of the last couple of years, instigated by Donald Trump, has kind of done the same thing to the global economy. You've had a chilling effect on global investment. Why this matters is that, at this stage of the recovery, as you all know, we've had massive employment growth. We may worry a lot about the quality of that employment, and some of it, indeed, the growth of employment, as the Resolution Foundation pointed out recently, is in some sense it's a success for the labour market, but also a response to weak wages. Financial insecurity has forced more people into the workforce, or has forced them to work more than they might have liked because of low wages. But we've had that successful employment growth. What we haven't seen is wage growth. This is the time in the recovery when we might have wanted to see that. And we might have actually used that money into people's pockets to extend the length of the recovery, because you've got companies, if they cost a bit more to employ workers, well, you keep them on, but you invest in making those workers more productive. And that actually is more money in workers' pockets, so they might spend some more money, but you've also lengthened the recovery by you've underpinned that increase in wages by increasing productivity. So we could have done all those things. Instead, we decided to have a trade war. When I'm explaining this to clients, the rest of the world, when I try and explain what happened to the UK, I sort of say, well, we've had, Germany and Japan have suffered from the US trade war. The UK's, well, the best way to model it is the UK's declared a trade war on itself and had very much the similar effect. But a lot of countries have sort of been prevented from increasing the longevity of the recovery. And China, having just got back from China, I can tell you they're not going to come to the rescue as they have in previous slowdowns in the last few years. They kind of ramped up spending, and it's helped keep the global economy afloat. We're not going to get that. So if we step back from all that, it does look like we will be seeing a recession sooner rather than later, though not necessarily in the next 12 months. When policymakers are thinking about the macro toolkit in this environment and how they should set their policies, clearly the financial environment for policy is unrecognisable relative to the early 2000s. Interest rates super low everywhere, which, as we know, has implications for how much you might be able to afford to spend on lots of good policies. And the big macro challenge, clearly, is not inflation, as we still used to worry about in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and not even really unemployment in large parts of the country, although we know there's some important areas where it's difficult, but weak growth. And I would say the big policy challenges going with that weak growth and low productivity are much more microeconomic, and they are a lot of the things that we're talking about, but it's financial insecurity, it's the implications of big tech for the structure of markets, the ability to extract consumer benefits from technology, for workers to extract benefits. It's a huge lot of micro challenges. And even though that environment has changed enormously, voters are not entirely wrong in sensing that the basic toolkit for responding has not changed very much at all. It's certainly not changed as radically or as fast as people would have wanted. And I think you see that particularly in the way that geography has started to loom so large. People have noticed that it really matters that we haven't had policies set for local conditions. And I would say, again, that's not just the UK. If you look at France, if you look at those European maps of the of different regions, smaller regions of Europe, and what kind of wage growth, what kind of income growth they've seen since the global financial crisis, we do probably have the worst picture in terms of the absolute gap in income, but also the relative performance of different parts of the UK. But France has overall reasonable growth, it's seen, in average wages, but it's only, I think, 2 or 3 provinces of France that account for that, and every other part of France has actually seen the average wage go down. So this regional dimension is hugely important there, and it's clearly been hugely important in the US as well. So geography is looming very large, and the climate, as we've already heard, and we will hear more in this session, has absolutely forced itself onto this agenda finally, but not yet, I would say, fundamentally into policy. I'm worried that we talk about inclusive growth a lot, we talk about climate change, and a lot of these sort of policymakers who swunk around meetings and go to Davos, they think it's fixed because they've sat in lots of seminars talking about it. And really there's quite a few more steps to go that they haven't necessarily thought through. That's exactly what today is for. So, I think this environment sort of paves the way, as we know, for some radically bad answers to these challenges. But I hope opens the way, and certainly as Charlotte has seen in starting the centre, for important debates and practical policy ideas on how to make policy inclusive, but most importantly, place-based and climate aware. And I would say, just very briefly, the 3 big tests we're going to have on our ability to have that kind of new toolkit. First, our response to the next recession, which we shouldn't kid ourselves, will be very important to our ability to do all those other things. You know, the average recession means a 4% decline in GDP and usually at least 1 million rise in unemployment. And when you think of the growth in employment that we've seen in the last few years, it's even more important that our response, we managed to maintain employment in response to that recession, because people, as the Resolution Foundation actually in the same report pointed out, have much less financial breathing space now than they did before. I think before the global financial crisis, only about half of people on below average incomes had no savings at all if anything goes wrong. Now, nearly 2/3 of people on below average incomes have no savings at all. So it's going to be absolutely important. We know monetary policy is not going to be able to play the role it did, because we can see interest rates are so low. Normally, you need to be able to cut interest rates by 5 percentage points in response to a typical recession. So even if we don't get another big financial crisis, we don't have the room to do what we did last time. And that really could make a difference. In fact, you know, the level of GDP could be 12% lower now if we hadn't had the response that we had last time, that macro response. So we know fiscal policy is going to have to play a much bigger role next time. And there's been a sort of discussion around trying to make fiscal policy a bit more like monetary policy, very timely, very quick, put it in the hands of central banks because they did such a good job last time. I hope that we don't end up completely going down that route, but we certainly need to think about how fiscal policy can play a better role, and how, in general, we take the advantage of low interest rates, the ability to spend more that comes from that, which we've seen in all the manifestos, politicians very happily taking that new room to spend, but making sure that that spending actually does reflect the kind of things that Charlotte's been talking about and the things we're going to talk about in this panel. You know, we've seen an enormous amount of talk about infrastructure spending. I know Charlotte and I were kind of frustrated when we were doing the commission that people only ever talk about physical infrastructure. Valuable though that is, if you talk to people at the Treasury about, are you also going to be incorporating social infrastructure spending into this? Place-based, for example, training models that can really help people manage transitions in work, get into new workplaces, and or work alongside other social policies. They're by their own admission, their thinking is nowhere on this. And although Sajid Javid, the Chancellor, is actually a Chancellor who believes very strongly in adult education, possibly the adult education budget wouldn't have fallen by a third in the last 10 years had he been Chancellor, but I think he doesn't necessarily have a good sense of how to make the training provision by area be really sensitive to local needs. So I think, you know, we have those two responses. There's how does fiscal policy kind of ramp up as a response to the next crisis, but also generally how do we spend more in a more place-based and more socially human way. And then I guess finally, you know, the third test is how do we absolutely embed our response on climate into that new agenda. And I think it's a bit of a temptation, certainly in these kind of highfalutin seminars that think they're solving the world, and Davos and elsewhere, to think that climate can kind of tick all these boxes. You know, it can help with stable policy. If you have a fiscal stimulus, you can just make it environmental. That you can also make yourself more popular, particularly with young people, by spending more on stuff that sounds green, it sounds environmental. But we know, and I know we'll probably hear a bit more, there are some tensions here, and there's some important timing questions that you have to think about. The amounts in general, in terms of money you can spend upfront on constructive climate investments, are probably not large enough to make a really big difference when it comes to responding to a recession, though I would say they definitely should be part of the mix. You probably can't do them quickly enough. They can certainly play a part. I think if you think about the chunk of emissions that comes purely from household heating. We know that the adaptation of households is a big piece of any response. I'm sure we'll hear more about it. That does have the potential also to be a profoundly progressive policy if you're helping households to manage that transition to more effective heating. But there are other areas, as we know, including raising the price of petrol, which raise more issues, and you have to think absolutely up front, like we never have before, really, about the distributive consequences, about the political economy of what you're doing, and think about the timing. I think even bigger challenge that we really haven't managed to do in the past is to think about how to manage the dislocations that come when we talk about a just transition, which many people in the audience have spent more time thinking about than I have. One thing that is very clear is that we're going to have to be a lot better at helping when it comes to sort of stranded industries, so-called, or stranded assets, human and physical. How are we going to manage those transitions in a way that understands, that learns some of these lessons about geography and place that we've had to learn over the last few years? So I do think that marrying these two things, inclusion and climate, into effective fiscal policies at a time when we actually need to be rewriting a lot of our fiscal rules and rethinking our toolkit, provides an amazing opportunity to show that we have learnt some of these lessons. But gosh, I think there's also a lot of room to get things wrong. So I hope we're all going to learn from people like Sam and Miato and how to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hugely instructive, not just for this session, but for the rest of the day. And the idea of putting fiscal policy in the hands of central bankers is a frightening one. So we should be lobbying against that one. Sam.
Let me see whether I can maneuver out of here. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to say some Davos-ish things, but mostly I want to make the case that inclusive zero carbon growth is feasible and unavoidable. In fact, there's no other version of growth than zero carbon. So that's the story I want to tell you. I'm going to tell you that in a sort of a series of steps. The first one will be hopefully an obvious one to you, but it always bears repeating. High carbon growth is neither inclusive nor welfare enhancing. So the alternative to zero carbon growth doesn't exist. If you sort of think through what a high carbon economy will do, there's nothing inclusive and there's nothing welfare enhancing in it. Those of you who listened to the news yesterday evening will have heard that our carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are at the record level. They're over 400 parts per million, 400 molecules per million molecules in the atmosphere now. If you ask when we have last experienced that, you have to go back a lot longer than Charlotte did in her history lesson. You have to go back to the Pliocene. You have to go back 5 million years. So we're sort of embarking in an experiment with the planet that we, as a species, as human sapiens, have never gone through. So there's absolutely nothing risk-free, nothing inclusive, nothing welfare enhancing in that. So the high carbon alternative we can take off the table. I assume that was clear to you, but it's often worth repeating these things. So if high carbon growth isn't feasible, if that's an oxymoron, is low carbon or zero carbon growth feasible? There's a lot of people out there who say the solution to climate change is degrowth. We have to consume less. And there's certainly an element of behavior change in what we have to do to be zero carbon. But I would make the point that it's actually possible to decarbonize an economy and be prosperous at the same time. I'm going to tell you that story in the words of 3 eminent economists. If there are any economists in the room, sorry to bring you back to your Economics 101. If there are non-economists in the room, I'm even more sorry. But the story goes as follows. If we embark on a zero carbon route, one of the things that will give us an immediate side benefit is something that Stephanie started talking about, which is the sort of the Keynesian investment boost, depending on where you are in the fiscal cycle and depending on how much fiscal headroom you have. There is sort of a room for, there's a lot of investment actually needed. I don't know how much it compares to a proper stimulus, but in absolute terms, there's a lot of zero carbon investment needed in infrastructure, in buildings, and that can give an economic boost. If you have the headroom to do so. It's also an opportunity to rebalance some of the geographical inequities that we have if you put that infrastructure in the right place, not just in the right way. Why do I emphasize that investment? One of the reasons is that the zero carbon economy is a much more capital intensive economy than the economy we are used to. If you think of an electric car, it's quite an expensive thing to buy, at least at the moment it is. It is an incredibly cheap thing to run. In fact, on a life cycle basis, it's almost as cheap to run a conventional car, and soon it will be. But the profile, the expenses you have, the profile of expenditure is very different. It's all upfront. Something similar is true for wind farms and solar panels and things like that. They cost something upfront. They're very cheap to run. So that gives you the capital, the Keynesian story of why I think zero carbon growth can be welfare enhancing. The second story I'm telling you is the story of externalities, which the economists amongst you will associate with Arthur Pigou. It isn't just climate change, that's the only environmental or societal problem that we have. And some of those environmental problems can be fixed in parallel to fixing the climate change issue. Air quality is a huge, huge problem. In this country, even more so in places like India. A colleague of mine has just come back from Delhi. He sort of had a sore throat and felt miserable for about a week. I mean, this is tangible, really bad stuff. We can sort out air quality plus minus. It's not fully true, but plus minus with similar sort of measures than we need for climate change. That hasn't always been the case. We had the unfortunate detour via diesel cars, which introduced a trade-off between air quality and climate. But when it comes to electric cars and decarbonized power systems, the two go hand in hand. Similar behavior changes like eating less meat. It's good for you. Your health will enhance. Some of the travel choices we have will be good for you. So you can think of a lot of side health, environmental side benefits that you will have as a consequence of the low carbon transition or the zero carbon transition. The final economist that I will invoke is Joseph Schumpeter, the man who gave us creative destruction. There's a lot of destruction, economic disruption that we need and that is going on and that we believe can be welfare enhancing because it shakes up the current economic system. I just give you one sort of piece of evidence to give a bit of substance to that point. Colleagues of mine at LSE did some work on the societal benefit of clean technology innovation, measuring societal benefit by the amount, by the number of times a clean patent is cited in other patents. And when you do that, you find out that the clean tech patents in automotives and in the power sector are much more societally beneficial than conventional patents in those sectors. In fact, they have citation counts that are very similar to things like IT, nanotechnology, robotics, the sort of technology that we think will transform life in the 21st century. Clean technology is on a par in terms of its societal innovation benefit. So that's the story of my three economists. There's a Keynesian story, a Pigouian story, and a Schumpeterian story that makes me believe that zero carbon growth is possible. Now, that doesn't make it painless. It means the end point will be prosperous, but it doesn't mean the transition from here to there is painless. This is a huge, deep structural transformation, and all huge, deep structural transformations are painful to somebody, to a lot of people. And that's where the just transition argument comes in. We have to make sure that, that those sectors, those workers that are risk being left behind get the reskilling, get the help, get the training that they need. Now, that goes with the grain of some of the stories we've heard of inclusive growth anyway, so that's not something we have to do just for carbon. That's something we probably should do anyway. It's also the case that people probably exaggerate the skill distance that most jobs have to travel. There are some jobs where the difference between your current skills and your future skills is quite big. There are lots of jobs where that isn't the case. If you're an architect, if you're a banker, if you're a bus driver, if you're in the IT department of a coal company, if you're in the HR department of a coal company, there's nothing in your skills that doesn't transfer to the clean economy. There are some pockets where we really have to look at, but it is less of a journey than we have to travel. I see I have a lot less time left, so let me just tell you, it is feasible, it will be done, or it can be done, but will it be done? I give you Exhibit A, which is the United Kingdom. Since 1990, the UK has grown by something like 70%. Greenhouse gas emissions have come down by something like 40-something%. If you translate that into carbon per unit of GDP, we emit 1/3 of the carbon per unit of GDP that we did in 1990. Of course, a lot of that was driven by economic factors rather than environmental policy factors, the dash to gas, the deindustrialization. But there's some policy involved in that. And let me just, in the few seconds that I have left, illustrate what that policy mix might look like. Those 42% of emission reductions, they have pretty much all occurred in one sector, electric power. We haven't touched most of the rest of the economy, and that's one of the problems. But let me tell you how it worked in electric power. It was a bundle of interventions. There was investment. A huge amount of money and subsidies and support went into pushing renewable energy. The offshore wind industry in the UK is a huge success story of how costs have come down on the back of reasonably enlightened policy and investment. So investment is the first component. Second component is regulation. Certain technologies and certain behaviors were just ruled out. In the case of the power sector, this was an EU directive on the large combustion plant, the large combustion plant directive on air quality, and that has taken a lot of coal activity out of the system. So regulation is the second component. The third component is pricing carbon to make sure that you have the right incentives when you make your emissions decisions. In the case of the power sector, there was the EU emissions trading scheme with a bit of a top-up that the UK put on top of the EU ETS price. So pricing carbon, disincentivizing bad behavior was number 3. Number 4 was the social safety net. Carbon pricing is regressive if you do it badly. So there was a series of policies that had to do with fuel poverty measures, preventing a slide into fuel poverty. Energy efficiency can help in that respect, but there are also some social support measures. So those 4 elements did it for the power sector, and my argument is we can repeat those 4 elements in the sectors that come now next. Surface transport, industry, buildings, agriculture, aviation. They're a lot harder than power, but we can do it as well. Thank you.
So clean growth is not only possible, it's the only option, and Miata's going to tell us a little bit more about how.
Yes, absolutely. Look, good morning. So, I think the first thing I'd say is that it's great that climate change has muscled its way back onto the political agenda. I think with credit to the sheer grit, will and determination of activists and campaigners and a generation of young people that have demanded that their voices be heard. And I think for us, it's amazing that the Green New Deal, an idea that came from organizations, including the New Economics Foundation a decade ago, has emerged as a key demand in response to the climate emergency. So the idea is a simple one, an unprecedented mobilization of resources of the sort that we have never achieved in peacetime in order to decarbonize the economy at pace, whilst creating hundreds of thousands of good jobs and lifting living standards across the country. At its heart is a recognition that climate change and the threat to our environment is a symptom of an economic system that is broken. The same economic system that is failing millions of people across the country. And so to tackle climate change, we must transform the economy, and we need to do this in a way that works for the majority of people. This means, quite frankly, an end to incremental changes to the status quo and tinkering around the margins, and time for quite fundamental, and dare I say it, radical change in the way that we do things and in the way that our economy works. Now, you know, some people will hear me say this and they will say, look, this is pie in the sky thinking, it just won't happen. And we say the conditions for such change has already started taking root. And this is being driven by the scale of the environmental challenge that we face, but also the economic breakdown that we're seeing. So we all know we're in a climate emergency. We've been told by experts that we have little over a decade to take drastic action to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. And it's not just the threat of climate change, it's the fact that we're depleting the Earth's natural resources at 1.5 times its ability to regenerate. This year, the UN warned that our nature is declining globally at rates that are unprecedented in human history. 1 million species are at risk of mass extinction, and by 2025, 2/3 of the world's population could be living under water stress conditions. Now look, this environmental challenge is often put in the too scary to deal with box, but I think we're going to be shaken out of our environmental complacency, whether we are ready or not, as it begins to bite on our day-to-day lives in ways that will demand urgent action. And we're already starting to see this. And we're already starting to see the shift in public opinion, with climate change now being one of the top issues for voters. Now, this environmental tipping point is coming at the same time as we need to confront deep economic problems in our economy. This entire day is about that very fact. But for me, first amongst this is the fact that the economy is just not working for everyone. And this has come into sharp focus since the financial crisis. So we've already heard that we've had growth, but it hasn't benefited huge swathes of our society. We've heard that we've had a decade of wage stagnation, hitting those on low to middle income the hardest. People are being squeezed as the cost of essential things that they rely on, from their housing through to their electricity, goes up. And living standards today have still not caught up to where they were in 2008. We've got 1 in 3 kids living in poverty, even though the majority of them are coming from families who are working. And we're seeing rising inequality, with wealth inequality being the litmus test here. All of this fueling economic and social discontent, which is calling into question the very model. So the environmental and the economic are coming together in quite a profound way that will force us to think about the nature of our economy, who it works for, and in whose interest it works. Opening up, we believe, the space, the appetite for consent for radical change of the sort that we are talking about through a Green New Deal. But to be transformative and to rise to the scale of the challenge we face, a Green New Deal for the UK, or indeed globally, has got to be ambitious. We're stretching targets for meeting net zero much sooner than 2050, and with much of the heavy lifting on decarbonising being done in the next 10 to 15 years. Businesses and private investment will be absolutely critical to this, and we've already seen positive steps in this direction, enabled and supported by government incentives and regulation to enable markets to respond to the climate imperative. But we are absolutely clear that this on its own will not be enough. We're not going to achieve the pace or the scale of change that we need without large-scale public investment in green infrastructure, technologies, and the skills that we need to transition. And when interest rates are at historic lows, this is precisely the time to borrow to make this investment. So we want to see the next government, whoever that might be, commit to a minimum of 2% of GDP in the next budget to delivering a green transition. And I think to people who say, look, we can't afford this, my argument is, look, we just can't afford not to do this. If the science is right, the more global temperatures rise, the more chaos we'll see in the system. More extreme weather conditions, our coastline disappearing, food scarcity from loss of crop yield, all driving climate-related poverty on a scale that we cannot even imagine. The cost not just in pounds, but in human suffering, will far outstrip the cost of any Green New Deal. So I think the choice before us is, do we take deliberate, concerned action now in order to drive and achieve the scale of change we need to, or do we sleepwalk into a crisis and throw money at the problem when it will be far too late? And I think when viewed like this, a Green New Deal becomes a no-brainer. But the government must then focus resources and support on places in order to drive a just transition. And this means implementing bold industrial transformation plans for places, but also putting local people, local businesses who understand the needs of their local economy in the driving seat. So a Green New Deal has got to come hand in glove with radical devolution of power and resources. And then finally, in order, I think, to consent to the scale of change that is inevitable, that we must ask of people, there has to be a good deal for the public. So through this investment programme, we should be looking to create jobs to replace the ones that will go as we end the use of fossil fuels. And the green economy that emerges must be owned by people and must work in their interest. This means collective ownership of green infrastructure and assets we will invest in, from renewable energy to fleets of public transport, to fleets of electric cars, to more cooperative ways of organising new industries that will spring up, from cooperative insulation companies through to cooperative energy companies. If, and it's a big if, we get this right, we could radically transform our economy so it works for people and planet. It is within our grasp, but I don't believe it will happen unless the movement that is growing by the day continues to apply pressure for radical change, bridging divides from left to right, from old to young, forcing our politics to confront the scale of the challenge and to step up in response.
A hugely powerful call to arms, I think it's fair to say. Thank you, Miata. We're running a little bit behind time, so I just want to sound out a few more remarks from within the panel rather than take questions from the audience, but there will be time later for you to pose your questions. I think the thing that struck me most of all is not necessarily the tension I expected in the discussion this morning, which was around the growth versus degrowth. It's more about, if we're going to do zero carbon, which we must, how can we afford it, particularly on the scale that you set out, particularly given the impending recession that was definitely outlined? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think Miata's right that there's more room to spend, and that's one advantage of the the dysfunctional financial environment that we're in, that we have extremely low interest rates that are not expected to get much higher anytime soon. So that ought to change what we think of as a sustainable spending. I think the only one of the things I worry about is, and I worry about at least in the US forms of the Green New Deal, I think there's lots of new deals around, and I think actually the European Commission, the new head of the European Commission, has put it very firmly on the agenda, and I'm very interested to see where she goes with it. But some of the more radical, some of the faster approaches, I do worry will end up being, I would say this, I know it sounds really annoying, but it would be counterproductive, because you're trying to go too fast. You might, if you don't get the sequencing right, you do raise all those dislocation issues, and potentially set back the course, if you like. So it does matter whether you're making those commitments for sort of 2030 or 35, and certainly the people who've been thinking about this longer than me, like Nick Stern, who I was talking to about this last week, was a little bit nervous about. We need to make sure that we sort of channel the energy and the enthusiasm into things that, yes, can help with ramping up infrastructure investment, which, by the way, will create jobs, but do it in a way that's we think about the timing and we think about what the implications are. Because France is a great example. I mean, that Gilets jaunes symbolise a policy that of increasing the gas price in a way that didn't transfer, didn't make sure that the money raised was actually going to some of the people that lost, let alone into environmental causes, and didn't think about how to frame the conversation and link it to more positive things. It just imposed this higher gas price. So although, you know, Macron has like been this great hero of environmental thing, but in France he's put back the cause quite considerably. So that's what I would worry about. I'm not so worried about you know, the sticker price on some of these things, because it's more important to get it right.
Okay, we're really short on time, but just a sentence from each of you.
Yeah, I mean, so the only thing I would add to that is I actually think the recession is, hate to use the word opportunity, but I think it is a moment, because in the context of constrained monetary policy, we don't have monetary policy as a lever, our automatic stabilizers in terms of social security have been denuded. Actually, fiscal policy becomes our route out of recession, spending out of recession. And the big question for the government then is, how do you spend in a way to unlock the Green New Deal? So actually, if you go through the set of projects that the Committee on Climate Change have identified, there are some that are shovel-ready, some that are you can ramp up quickly, like insulation, that actually we should be pumping lots of money into. So at the point of recession is absolutely the point to spend to unlock this.
Okay, Sam?
Yeah, 2 points. One is that we have a structural problem which we will have for a long time. So the business cycle is sort of incidental to it. We have to decarbonize wherever we are in the business cycle. This will happen in boom and bust times. That's the first observation. The other observation is that it does sort of require a balance. It does need investment, but it also needs regulation, and in my opinion, it needs a carbon price. Carbon prices are regressive, but you raise a lot of money with them. We did some calculation in the UK for the next 10 years. It raises about £350 million a week, for those of you who like those sorts of numbers. And you can do a lot with that to make a tax that is regressive, progressive.
Well, I think that's a great way to end, and look forward to seeing you after the break. Many thanks.